Well, good evening. Let me begin with an apology. Um, Today was really one of those days when it's good for me to not go among people. Kind of a crappy day for me. But all the same, I really regret not having made it to class because there's important stuff that we needed to talk about today. Um, and I thought that the best way to remedy my absence is just to say the core of the things that I wanted to talk about with you here in this video. I wanted today to be kind of an interactive day. That's not going to be easy to do, given that I'm probably just going to go right back to sleep after I finish recording this. But the one thing I wanted to do after I am done with this video is to go back to Angel and turn on this one feature that I'll hopefully be able to figure out. The feature is the discussion forums. I'll try to set it up so that there's a discussion forum inside of our Angel class space. You should be able to just find that when you log in. And if you want to post some questions or comments about this stuff or about the reading or anything else in the class into the discussion forum, I'll check it when I'm feeling better. And I really would appreciate using that as a kind of alternate means of communication. I'm not going to check it all the time, but if you start an interesting discussion or ask useful questions there, I'll remember that when it's time for me to tabulate the course grade for class participation. Okay. So even though I'm a bit out of it and I clearly don't have the world's finest video equipment, I thought that I could say a few useful things about the first 12 pages of the Outlines of Pyrrhonism. What Sextus is trying to do there isn't to start with the project of bringing about a suspense of all judgment in his readers. Okay, that begins with the reading for this weekend in the 10 modes. What he starts with is introductory stuff. And that stuff is more boring, and it's a shame. But I've asked myself, how would I write the Outlines of Pyrrhonism if it fell on me to, make a training manual for how to be a skeptic? And though I do some things differently, I think that I'd have to follow Sextus's decision in starting with this kind of an introduction, because without this kind of an introduction, I think that you'll lose most of the readers that you might actually convince, or as the case may be, unconvince with the skeptical project. Here's why. It's because we and the contemporaries of Sextus Empiricus were probably no different. When we encounter this idea of living completely without beliefs, our first thought is, well, that's impossible. That'll never work. No human being can live without believing something. Sextus gives us a response. He gives us a response to that worry without him having ever heard us say this. Why? Because the skeptics just see this coming. This just seems like one of those things that they need to get out of the way first. Like, is it even possible to live a life without beliefs? And they say, well, think about it. Think about the following considerations, and maybe you'll come to the conclusion that it is. If you do come to that conclusion, your next thought is probably going to be, okay, it might be possible to live without beliefs, but it sounds miserable. Just imagine going through life not having any beliefs about what's the best thing to do when you're feeling hungry, or whether you should get out of the way if like a chariot is racing towards you, or a bus, right? And isn't it just inevitable that a skeptic's life would be like awful and nasty and short? That is also addressed by Sextus Empiricus towards the end of the first 12 chapters. And we'll look at the way he addresses these questions in turn. But there's one place where we need to start for this whole project to get off the ground. And this is the distinction between appearance and reality. And it's so important that I even made a little prop for me to point at, because I don't have my whiteboard, without which I feel kind of impotent. So here's this. The distinction between appearance and reality. If we were in the classroom right now, here's what I would ask you. I'd ask you, well, just think of certain things that seem one way but aren't that way. Okay? I'll drink my chamomile tea. What people usually come up with are things like this. Like, well, I bought this one dress, and it seemed black when it was in the store, and then I paid for it, and I took it outside, and it turned out to be dark blue. It wasn't black at all. And it appeared one way, it seemed one way, but it was not that way. It was different. Okay. And those are all pretty familiar things. You know, something seems cold, but isn't cold. It only seems cold because you just came out of the shower and you're all hot. Or something seems warm because you just came from the outside, but it's really not that warm. It's just that your hands are cold, so it seems warm to you. That sort of thing is familiar to all of us. The difference between seeming and being, though, isn't just a difference between sensory perceptions. Okay, so these are sensory things, like whether a dress looks black or whether something feels warm to touch. We also say things like this. We say, he seemed so nice, but he turned out to be such a jerk. Right? Appearing one way, but the reality was different. We say things like, it seemed like a good reason, but it turns out that it wasn't a good reason. It only appeared like a good reason. But appearance and reality are different sometimes. Okay? Mathematicians sometimes come across proofs that appear valid, but in reality, they're not. It's just nobody caught the mistake. Some things appear just horribly immoral. But for a subset of those things that appear horribly immoral, when we think harder about them, we might discover that they're not immoral, that it's something about our culture or something about our upbringing that just makes us squeamish about a class of actions which, if we think about it harder, are perfectly morally okay. Or the opposite might be true, that some things seem just okay to us. You know, everybody does them maybe. But then when we think harder about it, we realize, no, that's actually wrong. And we shouldn't do that. And the other people who do it shouldn't do it either. So again, that's something that seems, something that appears one way, but is in reality different. Okay. So don't think that this appearance-reality distinction is something just purely philosophical. Like, everybody understands the difference between how things seem and how things are, and everybody makes use of this distinction in their daily life. We know that there's a gap. I drew it as a line, the line between appearance and reality. And what's the relationship of this line to the skeptical project? Well, here's what Sextus says about it. He says, the skeptical life is a life in which we live with the appearances. We only go with what is apparent. What we don't do, he says, is we don't dogmatize. And what is it to dogmatize? It's to make claims about how things really are. Okay, so if you're taking notes, put that in your notes. Dogmatizing is making claims about how things really are. And what is it to really be? It's to be on this side of the appearance-reality distinction. When we say that skeptics don't dogmatize, we just mean that the skeptics things appear to them a certain way. Sure, that's appearances. But what they don't do is they don't take the way things appear to them and just think, well, because it appears to me that way, that's how it really must be. And now that you think about it, you don't do that either, or at least not automatically. Or you don't, or maybe you do it automatically, but you realize you shouldn't do it automatically because you know very well that some things might not be as they appear. Think of all the examples that we just went through. Those are all examples in which things are not the way they appear. That kind of thing is possible. So when are things as they appear and when are they not as they appear? Well, if you ask that question very seriously, that's how the whole skeptical project will get underway. And that's the question that Sextus will ask very seriously when we get to the 10 modes in your reading for Tuesday. Okay, so now that we have this appearance and reality distinction under our belt, we have a better understanding of what the skeptical project is about. The skeptics are people who have the world appear to them a certain way, just like everybody else. The thing that makes them different from everybody else isn't that things seem to them a certain way, or things that, things seem to skeptics a certain way, just the way they seem to us a certain way. The difference is this. Skeptics don't make judgments based on the appearances. Whereas we non-skeptics, we dogmatists, we do. We think that we can learn about reality from the appearances. The skeptics are like, not so fast. It's not so simple to figure out what reality is just from the appearances. And so what we do is we withhold judgment. Okay? The way they say it is we suspend judgment. And that doesn't mean that we give up the appearances. It means we don't use the appearances to judge. We don't use the appearances to make claims about what's on this side of the appearance-reality distinction, the reality side. All right. So, what is it to live with the appearances? Well, think about it this way. Just one more difference between seeming and being, like an aesthetic difference. There's some stuff that we like, there's some stuff that I like, which I know is bad. And now I don't mean morally bad, I mean like aesthetically bad. So there's music that I like, that I know is bad music. But, I know it's bad, I just like it. I know it's bad. I'll give you an example like that with food. I like Taco Bell, even though I realize it's like bad food. And I don't mean bad as in like bad for you. I mean bad as in like the quality of the food, by any standards of good culinary judgment. Taco Bell food isn't good food. It's just that I like it. So, back to this. Here's my claim. And it's a dogmatic claim. Taco Bell, in reality, isn't good food, but the way it appears to me is pleasing. Okay? It's pleasing to me even though it's actually not good food. And this is a good model for thinking about skepticism. What the skeptics won't do is what I just did, which is to judge something to be bad food, or bad music, or bad anything. Why? Because that kind of judging is making a claim about the reality. They stick to only claims about appearances. And what is it to make claims about appearances? It's to say stuff like, well, I don't like it. That's describing how something seems to you. It doesn't please you. It doesn't appear pleasing to you. But you suspend judgment about how it really is. So skeptics have their likes and dislikes, and they like certain activities. They, being sick makes them feel a certain way, and I'm sure it's just as uncomfortable as it is for anybody else. But like a headache is also an appearance, right? The thing about a pain is that there's nothing more to the pain than just the way it appears to you. And it appears to skeptics the same way, probably an uncomfortable way. Honey, Sextus says, appears sweet to me. But what makes me a skeptic is I refuse to dogmatize about the true nature of honey. I refuse to say, in reality, honey is sweet. I just live with the appearances. And, as a skeptic, I like Taco Bell, but I refuse to say whether it is or isn't good food. I just stay on the level of, I like it. And why should I need to decide whether or not it's, in reality, good or bad food? The fact that I like it is good enough for me to work out how I should behave. And this is the next point. The next point is in the question, how does a skeptic live if they're living entirely with the appearances? How do you live without making judgments about anything? Not just judgments about what's good food, but judgments about what are moral actions, judgments about what is prudent for me to do. Is this investment a good investment, or does it merely appear to be a good investment without really being a good investment? These are things that the skeptic isn't in a position to settle. And so how do they live? How do they make decisions? How do they work out how to act? Think about that question. Sextus gives you an answer to that question in your reading. And the answer is this. I'm on page 23. Okay, he says, adhering then to appearances, we live in accordance with the normal rules of life, undogmatically, seeing that we cannot remain wholly inactive. So, are skeptics just going to sit there, just idle, wait for them to starve to death because they don't know what to do? Things only appear to them a certain way, but they refuse to make judgments about their appearances. So what do they do in a state like that? Well, just sitting there is also a decision. It's not like just sitting there is our default state. Well, that's the right way to ask the question. Well, what is our default state? Is our default state just idleness? No, our default state isn't just idleness. Here's what Sextus thinks our default state is. We can't remain wholly inactive. Here's what we're going to do. The regulation of life, he says, is fourfold, and that one part of it lies in the guidance of nature. It's like our instincts. Another in the constraint of the passions, another in tradition of laws and customs, and another in instruction of the arts. Nature's guidance is that by which we are naturally capable of sensation and thought. Constraint of the passions is that whereby hunger drives us to food and thirst to drink. Tradition of customs and laws, that whereby we regard piety in the conduct of life as good, but impiety as evil. Instruction of the arts, that whereby we are not inactive in such arts as we adopt, but we make all these statements undogmatically. Well, that seems kind of strange, but I think we can decode that and make that make sense. And the question was, if we live without drawing conclusions about anything in reality, what's going to guide our action? And I think the modern one-word answer for that would be just human defaults. We are going to revert to default principles. They're not principles. They're just kind of things that regulate our action. And one of the things that regulates our action is just instinct. We're natural creatures that have some instincts. And these instincts sometimes impel us to act. So what drives us to food is partly instinct. And what drives us to sex, what drives us to protect ourselves from being hurt, these are all instinctual activities. And we don't follow our instincts voluntarily. It's not like you sit there and you decide to go with your instincts. When we go with our instincts, it's more like our instincts kind of suggest a course of action, and there's nothing else in our system, in our belief system, that leads us to override our instincts. This is, of course, going to work for Pyrrhonian skeptics too, because they don't have a belief system at all. So when their instincts push them in a certain direction, their instincts win. Unless their instincts collide with one of the three other regulations of life that they mention. The second one is their passions, like their emotions. And our emotions might lead us to, like punch a guy in the face, right? Or to cry, or to like really want to talk to that pretty woman, These are things that, again, drive us, and they drive us without forcing us to make commitments about what is and isn't real. The inputs for those drives are appearances alone, because that girl who, we feel like we want to talk to, we want to talk to her not because she is pretty, but because she appears pretty. It's the appearance that was good enough. So that's the way the passions will drive our action. We might have a passion for certain foods, for certain music, things like that. And those passions will pull us towards those things which we have a passion for, and push us away from the things that we're passionately against. The next one is customs. And think about customs in this ordinary sense of you just inherit certain dispositions to behave from society. And you ask somebody, why you do this? And they just go, what do you mean, why? I don't think about reasons why. I just do this because this is how it's done. This is just the normal approach from our society. Okay? Sextus in many places is going to say things like, look, there are philosophers and foreign people who do things very differently from the way we Greek people or Roman people do things. I mean, Greece and Rome, by the time of Sextus, was a kind of merged empire under the rulership of Rome, but in big parts of the empire, Greek was still spoken. Sextus Empiricus was one of the Greek-speaking Romans. It's not clear where he even lived. We don't know enough about him in biography. But wherever he lived was a place that had its own customs. Those customs were familiar to Sextus Empiricus, and those customs drove him to act. And they drove him to act even if he didn't have any reason to think that the customs that he grew up with were in any sense good. Right? Customs just drove him without any judgment at all. And finally, there's training. Sextus Empiricus was trained as a doctor, and that is to say that he sees himself as having internalized a kind of method, a certain decision procedure. And once he internalized that decision procedure, that internalized procedure guides his actions. Now, the question you might ask is, well, yeah, but did he internalize a good procedure? And that question, Sextus would answer by saying, well, maybe I did, and maybe I didn't. That's something I suspend judgment about, because that's a matter of reality. Is it a good or not good training that I received? But the fact is that I received some kind of training, because that training now leads me to behave like a doctor. And that is just another one of those influences on my behavior. So to sum this up, what does a skeptic live like? What does a skeptic's life look like? Sextus's answer is, you're not going to sit there like a lump and wait for, nature to execute you. What you do instead is you live with the appearances. What you do is you follow your instincts. What you do is you obey your passions. You follow the customs that you've internalized, and you follow the training in your profession that you've internalized. These are all things that you just do without stopping to think whether your instincts or your training or your customs or your passions are leading you to a good action. Okay? You just do the action. You don't stop and judge whether it's good. That would be to dogmatize. And that's what the skeptics don't do. But the effect is that they live a normal life, right? They just live like normal people. If they're Greek, they just live like other Greeks because they've inherited the customs of other Greeks. And they've been trained in a profession, and they act like normal practitioners of that profession. They're not freaks, Sextus says. The Pyrrhonian skeptics look like normal people and behave like normal people. What's different about them is different, I guess, largely on the inside. There's a certain quietude that he thinks follows. Well, I don't want to say that quite so bluntly. He says that it appears to him, okay, again, he's not saying this is how it really is. He's saying, well, it appears to me as a doctor that people who come around to the school of Pyrrhonian skepticism find themselves with a kind of sense of inner peace and quietude because they're no longer trying to figure out the question that everybody else is trying to figure out, which is like, what should I do with my life? How should I live? What's the right course of action? Should I marry this woman or not? Should I go into this profession or that profession? Are my customs good, or do I need to reject my society in order to live a fulfilling life, in order to live a flourishing life or a morally good life? What does it take to live a flourishing life or a morally good life? These are the questions that philosophers are struggling with, and these are questions that skeptics don't struggle with. And why don't they struggle with them? It's because these are all questions that presuppose a certain understanding of reality. What really is more important than what other thing? What really is more valuable than something else? And these are questions about which the skeptics suspend judgment. So they're not questions that play a role in their lives. What plays a role in their lives? Well, their instincts, their feelings, their customs, their professions. That's what guides their actions. They just live without thinking about what they should do. They just follow the human defaults. Let's put it that way. Well, not just human defaults, because the first two are, I guess you could say, biological. Our instincts and feelings. These are things that are built into us. The second two, the customs and the training, these are social things. We inherit our customs from our social environment. We inherit our training from our social environment. So we could think of the first two as like skeptics obey nature, skeptics also obey nurture, and somehow these four different forces will always suffice to pull them in some direction or other in life. And the skeptics don't feel like they have any authority to override these defaults that they've inherited from nature and nurture. And so they just follow them, and that's what the skeptical life is like. So you see, it's a possible life to live. It is possible to live without dogmatizing, to live without declaring something to be real, without committing to any beliefs. You can just live by the defaults. It's not like the human defaults are going to leave you sitting there. Okay. So there we have our answer to the first question. The question, is it possible to live as a skeptic? Sextus just described to you what he thinks it's like to live as a skeptic. That shouldn't seem impossible. The second question was, well, okay, it's possible, but isn't it miserable? And here's his answer there. Of course, he can't say, no, it's wonderful. Why can't he say that? Well, he's a skeptic. So if he said skepticism leads to a kind of flourishing and happiness, that would be a dogmatic view. Okay? He can't say that. That's why he has to be all cagey and say, well, it seems to us that once people sort of convert their life into a skeptical practice, they do fine. Of course, maybe they're living miserably. We don't know. We suspend judgment about it. But we're doing all right. Perot, the person after whom Pyrrhonian skepticism is made, lived to a surprisingly old age by the standards of the ancient world, and was a well-respected guy and a nice guy and a competent general. Same with the other skeptics. They're, competent doctors and upstanding citizens and nice people. Why? Because they just follow the customs, they follow the instructions of their profession, and they follow their inner nature, and they get by just fine. Now let's contrast them to the people who live not by the defaults, but by some philosophy. Remember, the idea in the Hellenistic age is that you need to do philosophy first, because philosophy is what's going to help you figure out how to live. So Sextus says, well, let's look at some of these people who are living according to a philosophy, who are living dogmatically. There was a guy, Diogenes, one of the Cynics, who had this principle. And you might think the principle is a reasonable principle. It was, if something is not shameful, then it's not shameful to do in public. Right? If it's not shameful to do, then why should you be ashamed of doing it in the public? Well, so on many accounts, he would have sex with his wife in the marketplace. Why? Because it's not shameful to have sex with his wife. So why should it be shameful to have sex with his wife in the marketplace? It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just having sex with his wife. On other accounts, he would masturbate in the marketplace. And masturbating isn't shameful, so why should masturbating in the marketplace be shameful? And now you might look at that and you go, he's kind of got a point. I mean, I'm not going to do that. You don't do that. But I sort of see where he's coming from. And here's what the Pyrrhonian skeptic would tell you. He would say, well, see, this is what you get when you're someone who lives by a philosophy. He lived by a principle, when instead he should have been skeptical of the principle. And the Pyrrhonian certainly would be skeptical of the principle. If it's not shameful, then it's not shameful to do it in public, because they're skeptical of every principle. But for somebody who's dogmatic, who's credulous about it, Sextus says, well, look at that guy. There he is, masturbating in the marketplace because of some philosophy that he accepted. You want that to be you? That guy's a freak. And this is the cautionary tale of accepting principles without having the right to be sure that those principles are good. That might leave you like masturbating in the marketplace, and you don't want that to be you. Okay? You're better off as a skeptic. Better off as a skeptic than somebody who accepts a philosophy which is mistaken. And of course, you could do worse than masturbating in the marketplace. You could be, a much worse kind of fanatic whose ideology compels him to strap a bomb to himself and explode himself in the marketplace and kill a bunch of people with him. That could only happen if you're steered by an ideology. And if you stop and think about it, you think like, wow, what what a good remedy skepticism would be for people who feel compelled to blow themselves up in the marketplace because of some misguided ideology. If only they employed a bit of skepticism, then they could have spared themselves this kind of awful end. And now you're supposed to go, wait a minute, okay, we're talking about other people, but what about me? Like, I have an ideology, I act according to principles, and to you, Sextus would say, well, you better be sure that the principles according to which you're acting don't make you some kind of a fanatic. You want to make sure that you're not the sort of freak who's masturbating in the marketplace, or worse. So how can you tell? How can you tell if the principles that you live by are good principles? Well, you might have some rule of thumb, and we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to get to the nitty-gritty next week. For now, it suffices to say that whatever principles you do live by, you better have good reasons to live by those principles. It better not be stupid principles. You don't want to be the sort of person who lives by misguided or even monstrous principles. And how do you know you're not that person as long as you're living by principles? Isn't one solution just to abandon all principles, suspend judgment about all these things, and live like a skeptic? That's what Sextus says. I don't know if that's so crazy. So as a preventative medicine for fanaticism, misguided fanaticism, skepticism might just be the thing. Okay. And then finally, we get to the story of Apelles the painter. Apelles the painter is supposed to be a kind of metaphor, the story of his attempt to draw a horse that had like a foaming nostril because he had run very far, right? And it's really hard to draw that kind of foam with a paintbrush. And Apelles held high standards for the accuracy of the way his paintings represent his subjects. And he was just like, well, I can't very well represent that foam accurately with my brush. And he just wanted to get it right, and he couldn't do it. And then he just gave up. So let's think about it. Like, his goal was to achieve reality, was to achieve sort of veracity in the painting he was producing. And he found that, by sort of just trying and trying and trying to do it, he wasn't getting anywhere. So he took his sponge that he would wipe his brushes on, and he threw that at the painting, having given up. And just as if by accident, the sponge hit the horse like right where it's supposed to, and it produced the effect of the foam that he was trying to paint with the brush. Okay. This is obviously an allegory. What's he trying to say? Well, the allegory is an analogy. The goal of representing the scene for Apelles is supposed to be parallel to the goal that we all have in doing philosophy, at least in the Hellenistic times, which is how to achieve well, how to achieve flourishing, how to live well. That's the goal. Okay? And how do we do this? Well, we turn to philosophy, because who else is going to figure it out if not the philosophers? If we stop and try to figure it out, then we make ourselves philosophers. This is a philosophical subject. What is it to live well? What is it to live a life that's worth living? Now, that's a not obvious question to ask. It's an important question, and it's a philosophical question, and it's a hard question to answer. So like Apelles, we're like banging our head, trying to find an answer to that question which is good enough for our standards. And we're frustrated. And here's the Pyrrhonian skeptic who, is trying to get to the answer and then finally just gives up and throws the sponge. And then discovers that the goal he was aiming at, this sense of inner peace that would come from figuring out what's important in life, that sense of inner peace washed over him as if by accident. And it's not that he figured out the answer, it's just that he decided to go on living without having figured out the answer. So think about it this way. Imagine that if in order to do something, you first needed to figure out, according to good principles, that that thing was the right thing to do. Well, how do we know what's the right thing to do? Well, last semester I taught a class on ethics, and I can tell you, you students, you have no idea about what the answer is to the question, what's the difference between right and wrong? Sure, you can give me some answers, but it doesn't take me very long for me to convince you, those answers are just mistaken. They don't even satisfy your standards. And it's kind of an important question, but it's a hard question to figure out an answer to. So imagine, waiting to act until you're really confident that you've figured out what the right thing is to do. Imagine if you had a friend like that. They're just well, no, I can't do anything until I figure out the criterion by which I can judge what is the right thing to do. And you ask them, well, you're not going to study, you're not going to come out, to a party with us? And he's like, no, I need to figure out whether those things are right. And I don't even know where to begin, but it's important, and my actions need to be justified. That kind of a person will probably just sit there forever. And then again, and then the skeptic would stop you and again go, well, okay, look at this scene and tell me who's the freak. The person who's banging their head against the wall, trying to figure out correct principles, the philosopher? Or is it the person that just says, fuck it. I'm not going to act according to principles. I'm going to act according to my instincts, my passions, my customs, and my training. Not because I think any of those things are right. I suspend judgment about whether those things are right. But those things will push me along. And I'll just let them. I'm not going to override them because I don't know what to override them with. So I'm just going to live by the defaults. That's not a worse life than the life by which you require yourself to figure things out. Is it? Okay. So there you have the kind of introduction to the Pyrrhonian project. In the introduction, we've made this distinction between appearance and reality. Said the Pyrrhonian skeptic is somebody who doesn't dogmatize, which is to say, he doesn't make claims about how reality really is. He doesn't have any beliefs about things that go beyond the appearances. But he lives with the appearances. He likes certain things that please him. He doesn't like certain things. And has those likes and dislikes not as judgments, but just as, as preferences. Some things please him, some things don't. His life is regulated by instincts, passions, customs, training, whereas he's not dogmatic about any of those things being right. If you ask him, well, how do you know that the Greeks have the correct customs? He would say, I never said that they do. I don't know how to figure out which customs aren't correct. So until I figure this out, I'm just going to, cruise through life by the defaults. And maybe cruising through life by the defaults is the most merciful choice that we can make. Or at least it should seem that way to you if you're prone to dogmatizing. Because it's not Sextus that is asserting these things to you. He suspends judgment about all these things. It's for your benefit that he's making these arguments. You, who haven't gotten rid of all your beliefs yet. You probably think that living as a skeptic is going to be bad for you. What's the skeptic got to do to you in response? Well, it's like this. Here's another drawing I made. You probably think that skepticism will serve you badly in life. And you think you have reasons for thinking that, right? You're a dogmatist. So Sextus just wants to pile on some reasons on the other side. Reasons that push against your prejudice against the skeptical way of life. And if he gave those reasons to the right degree, then that should balance out your prejudice and leave you where? Leave you in a state of suspension of judgment. Sextus's word for this is equivalence, being equally pulled in the direction that skepticism is a good idea versus skepticism is a bad idea. We all start this book with the thought skepticism must be a bad idea. Sextus doesn't try to talk you out of it into thinking that skepticism is a good idea. He tries to make you suspend judgment about it the way you should suspend judgment about everything else. So because you start with a judgment already, he wants to balance out that judgment with an equal and opposite force. And I think that the reasons why he gave are reasons that have a chance of working. Think of the alternative to skepticism. One, being a dogmatist and just jumping to some conclusion with the danger of that conclusion being totally ridiculous and monstrous. You don't want that. And the other one is just be so careful and really do your reasoning according to some very high standards. But those standards aren't standards that you're going to meet. You're going to sit there like a lump, like waiting to figure out how you should act when all your friends, all your skeptical friends, are out acting. They're at the party, they're in their classes, they're doing stuff. And here you are, like wondering whether any of those things are the right thing to do, given that you have all this buffet of alternatives. So maybe skepticism isn't such a bad idea. Okay? That's the starting point that we need to have as our starting point before we get into the meat of the skeptical project, which is the mutual annihilation of our beliefs. I think I'll stop here. I hope this at least made some sense to you. I'm sorry that I'm so out of it today. When you see me on Tuesday, I'll have my coffee. Today is just I'm not feeling well enough for that. But I think that I'll be back to 100%. And I'm looking forward to your questions. I'll also check the forums once I get those things up, so please take a look there. You have an assignment to read, pretty short assignment, the first 4 modes. Once you get done with that, make sure you do the test after every reading before class on Tuesday. Thank you to those of you who did the test on the first one. Most of you, and the vast majority of you, I got a grade 4 in that. The grades ranged widely, but quite a few were 10 out of 10, so I'm pleased with that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on Tuesday, and I'll start learning your names and all that stuff. Okay.